Before my only son stood at the altar, I drove to a little tailor shop on the edge of Savannah to pick up the suit I'd had altered for the rehearsal dinner. The owner, a quiet Vietnamese man named Henry Nguyen who had pressed my shirts and hemmed my trousers for 22 years, looked up the moment I walked through the door. The color left his face like water draining from a sink. He crossed the shop in 4 steps, flipped the deadbolt, turned the sign to closed, and grabbed my forearm with both hands. He steered me backward through the curtain into the fitting alcove at the rear of the store without saying a single word. He pressed his finger to his lips, pointed at the thin wall behind me, and mouthed 2 words, "Stay. Listen." Then he pulled the curtain closed and walked back to the front. I stood there in the narrow space between the mirror and the wall, completely in the dark about what I was doing or why. 10 seconds later, the front doorbell chimed. Footsteps, on hardwood, 2 sets. I recognized the first voice immediately. It belonged to Cassandra, my son Daniel's fiancée. My name is Raymond Caldwell. I am 64 years old. I spent 37 years as a federal prosecuting attorney in the Southern District of Georgia before I retired. I have stood inside courtrooms and listened to men describe things that would make most people physically ill. I know how deception sounds. I know the particular cadence of a lie dressed up in the language of love. I know what it means when someone's story is just a little too smooth, a little too practiced, a little too complete. Standing behind that thin curtain in Henry's shop, I heard something I had not heard in all my years in law, a woman calmly and conversationally discussing how to end my son's life. Cassandra's voice was low and unhurried. She was speaking to a man I did not recognize. She called him Marcus. She said that Daniel had finally agreed to add her name to the deed on the lake house in Hilton Head, and that the financial planner appointment was set for the morning after the honeymoon. She said that once the joint investment accounts were consolidated, they would have everything they needed. Then the man named Marcus laughed softly and said the word timeline, and Cassandra replied that the mountain biking trip in Colorado was already booked, that the trail was remote, and that Daniel had never ridden at altitude before. She said, "It won't take much. He's trusting." I did not move. I did not breathe. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and I let the words settle into me the way cold water settles into cracked pavement. My son Daniel was 31 years old. He was a high school history teacher, kind and open-hearted in the way that only children raised with genuine love can be. He had been engaged to Cassandra for 14 months. He thought she was the great love of his life. She was standing 12 feet away from me, talking about a remote mountain biking trail. They stayed for perhaps 8 minutes. I heard the door chime when they left. Henry pulled back the curtain immediately. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the fabric. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then I reached out, put my hand on his shoulder, squeezed once, and walked out to my car. I sat behind the wheel for a long time. Every instinct I had spent nearly 4 decades sharpening was firing at once. But underneath all the professional machinery, there was something else entirely, a father's terror, cold and absolute, sitting in my chest like a stone dropped into deep water. Daniel had no idea. He was at home right now, probably grading papers or watching baseball, counting down the days until his wedding. And the woman he was going to marry had just told a man named Marcus that he was trusting. Like it was a flaw, like it was something she intended to use. I did not go to the police, not yet. I had been a prosecutor long enough to understand exactly what I had. A conversation overheard through a wall, no recording, no corroboration, no documentation. A defense attorney would demolish it in 20 minutes. I needed evidence. I needed the kind of evidence that does not leave a room for argument. I drove home and made 2 phone calls. The first was to my son. I kept my voice steady and warm, told him I had picked up the suit and that everything looked wonderful, and that I was looking forward to the rehearsal dinner on Friday. He laughed and said Cassandra had picked out a new centerpiece design and he wanted my opinion. I told him I loved him, and I would see him soon. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my kitchen for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The second call was to a man named Earl Booker. Earl had spent 20 years as a financial crimes investigator with the FBI field office in Atlanta before a bureaucratic restructuring ended his career abruptly and unjustly. I had fought alongside him on 3 of the most complex wire fraud cases the district had ever prosecuted. He was meticulous, relentless, and completely without sentiment when it came to finding the truth. I told him I had a situation and that I needed him the following morning. Earl arrived at my house at 7 a.m., carrying 2 coffees and a laptop bag. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression the same flat, focused look I remembered from the courtroom gallery. When I finished, he opened his laptop and said, "Tell me her full name and the city she told Daniel she grew up in." I told him, "Cassandra Reeves, originally from Charlottesville, Virginia. Parents both deceased," she had said, "within a year of each other. No siblings. A clean, simple background with nothing to grab onto." It took Earl 4 hours. Cassandra Reeves of Charlottesville, Virginia, did not exist in any meaningful sense before 6 years ago. There was no high school enrollment, no college transcripts that matched the university she claimed, no lease agreements, no utility accounts, no digital footprint of any kind before a driver's license application filed in 2019. Earl traced the license application back through a chain of addresses, each one a dead end, a vacant apartment, a commercial mailbox service, a storage facility in suburban Charlotte. What he found instead, buried under 3 layers of name changes and state line crossings, was a woman named Sandra Rivas, 38 years old. Originally from a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, Sandra Rivas had a civil judgment filed against her in 2017 in connection with a disputed inheritance claim involving an elderly widower she had dated briefly before his death, from what his family called a suspicious fall from a second-story deck. The case had been investigated and ultimately closed when the medical examiner ruled it accidental. The widower had no life insurance policy, and the inheritance dispute had been settled out of court when the family agreed to pay Sandra a small sum simply to make her disappear. She had walked away with $40,000 and a new name. I stared at the documents Earl had printed and laid across my kitchen table. My hands were perfectly still. After 37 years, you learn to receive terrible information without flinching. But there was something in this particular moment looking at a photograph of the woman my son kissed goodnight every evening that required everything I had. Earl pointed to a name that appeared twice in the civil case filings. Marcus Rivas, listed as Sandra's brother. An address in Charlotte. I looked at Earl. He looked at me. "They have the same last name," I said. "They do," he said, "but they don't have the same mother." He pulled up a second document, a birth certificate for Sandra. A different one for Marcus. Different mothers, same father, half-siblings, raised apart, reunited in adulthood. And from everything Earl had assembled in the last 4 hours, they had been working together for at least 5 years. The wedding was in 3 days. I told Earl we needed to move fast, but that I could not afford a single mistake. If Cassandra sensed any shift in my behavior, any stiffening, any coldness, any moment of hesitation, she would adapt. I had watched defendants do it in real time. The professional ones could recalibrate in the middle of a sentence. I needed to look like the same slightly skeptical but ultimately accepting future father-in-law I had been performing for the past 14 months. So that evening, I drove to Daniel and Cassandra's apartment with a bottle of wine and a story about running into an old colleague at the Tailor shop. I sat at their kitchen table for 2 hours. I watched Cassandra pour the wine and ask about my health and call me Ray the way she always did, with that particular warmth that I had once found disarming and now understood as a practiced tool. I watched her touch my son's hand across the table. I watched Daniel look at her the way he had looked at things he loved since he was a small boy, with his whole face open, nothing held back. It was the hardest 2 hours of my life. On the drive home, I called Earl and told him I needed 3 more things: a certified toxicologist, a contact inside the Savannah Police Department I could trust completely, and a financial forensics attorney named Beth Harmon, who had been my colleague for 15 years and was, in my judgment, the sharpest legal mind in the state of Georgia. I did not sleep that night. The following morning, Earl reported that he had made contact with a private toxicologist named Dr. James Tran, who operated an independent analytical laboratory on the north side of Atlanta. I asked Earl why a toxicologist. He pulled up a text message thread he had recovered using a legal data broker service from a number registered to the Charlotte address where Marcus Rivas had lived 18 months ago. The thread was brief and clinical. One message read, "Same supplement approach as before. Need 2 weeks minimum at current dosage." The response, "Understood. Altitude will do the rest." I read the thread twice. Then I told Earl I needed to get into their apartment. I want to be clear about what I did and why. I am a man who spent nearly 4 decades arguing in front of judges for the sanctity of evidence and the integrity of the law. I understood precisely what I was doing and what it could cost me in a courtroom. I made the calculation the way any father makes a calculation when the law's timeline does not match the timeline of his son's survival. I chose my son. Daniel had a spare key hanging in a small wooden rack by his front door, a habit I recognized because I had built the same rack for my own house when he was 7 years old. 2 days before the wedding, while Daniel was at school and Cassandra was at a venue appointment I had confirmed through a text exchange with Daniel, I used that key. I moved through the apartment with the same focused patience I had once used to walk crime scenes. I was not looking for something dramatic. I was looking for something small. A prescription bottle with a label removed. A supplement container that did not match its packaging. I found it in the back of the bathroom cabinet, behind a box of allergy medication, a clear plastic container labeled Daily Wellness Blend, the kind of thing you could buy at any health food store. Except the capsules inside were a color I had never seen in any wellness blend, a dense, matte gray-green. I took 4 capsules. I replaced the volume with 4 capsules from an identical container of actual magnesium supplements I had purchased on the way over. I sealed the container and put it back exactly where I had found it. I left the apartment and drove directly to Atlanta. Dr. Tran did not waste time. He ran the mass spectrometry analysis while Earl and I waited in a room with bad coffee and fluorescent lighting. 3 hours later, he came in and set the report on the table between us. He sat down, folded his hands, and explained what he had found with the steady, measured delivery of a man who had testified in court before. The capsules contained a combination of a high-dose beta blocker, a prescription-strength cardiac suppressant, and a compound commonly used in veterinary sedation. In a healthy adult at sea level, the combination would produce profound fatigue, confusion, and a significant drop in blood pressure. In a healthy adult at high altitude, performing strenuous physical activity, the cardiovascular suppression would prevent the heart from responding normally to the demands of exertion. The result, Dr. Tran said, placing the report flat on the table, would present at autopsy as cardiac arrest, secondary to altitude sickness, indistinguishable from natural causes without specifically targeted toxicological screening. He looked at me directly and said, "Whoever formulated this knew exactly what they were doing." I thanked him. I asked him to certify the report and retain the chain of custody documentation. Then Earl and I drove back to Savannah in silence for a long time before either of us said anything. I called Beth Harmon from the road. I told her I needed her to look at the real estate deed modification Daniel had signed, adding Cassandra's name to the Hilton Head property, the joint brokerage account transfer forms, and the beneficiary designations on Daniel's life insurance policy. I asked her specifically whether any of those documents contained language that would be unusual or disadvantageous in ways a non-attorney would not notice. She called me back 40 minutes later and said yes. The beneficiary redesignation on the life insurance policy, a $250,000 policy Daniel had taken out 3 years ago, contained a clause that accelerated the payout timeline to 30 days from date of death in the event of accidental injury-related mortality. She said it was buried in an amendment addendum, presented as standard language. She said it was not standard. I told her I needed her at the rehearsal dinner on Friday. I then called Detective Sandra Morrow at the Savannah Police Department, a woman I had worked alongside on 4 separate cases during my career, who was thorough, trustworthy, and deeply unimpressed by the kind of people who believed they were smarter than the law. I told her what I had. I told her what I needed. She listened, asked 3 precise questions, and said she would make 2 calls. By Thursday evening, there were things in place at the rehearsal dinner venue that Cassandra and Marcus had no knowledge of whatsoever. Friday arrived with the specific kind of hot, heavy Savannah air that makes a linen suit feel like a second skin by 10 in the morning. I dressed slowly and deliberately, the way I had always dressed before a closing argument, with the full understanding that what I wore and how I carried myself was information I was communicating to every person in the room. I tied my tie in the mirror and allowed myself one long breath. Then I became someone Cassandra believed she understood completely. A quiet, vaguely melancholy older man who had finally come to terms with the fact that his son was building a life that did not center around him. I arrived at the restaurant early. The space was beautiful, exposed brick, low candlelight, round tables arranged around a small raised platform where the rehearsal toasts would be delivered. I noted the positions of the 3 individuals who were not there for dinner. I made eye contact with one of them and looked away. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later with Cassandra on his arm. and a smile I recognized from his first day of kindergarten, full and uncomplicated, and completely unguarded. Marcus was introduced to me as a friend of Cassandra's from college, who happened to be passing through Savannah. He was tall and well-dressed and very warm in a way that reminded me, with uncomfortable precision, of the defendants I had disliked the most. I shook his hand and said it was wonderful to meet him. The dinner unfolded the way these dinners do, courses arriving and departing, conversation traveling in lazy circles around the table, the particular low hum of people performing their best versions of themselves for a room that includes people they have not met before. I ate almost nothing. I watched Cassandra refill Daniel's water glass twice. I watched Marcus check his phone once and angle the screen away from everyone at the table before putting it back in his pocket. I watched my son laugh at something Cassandra said and lean over to kiss her temple. I watched him and felt the weight of every ordinary moment I had ever taken for granted settle across my shoulders like weather. After the main course was cleared, the officiant made a small speech. Then Cassandra leaned forward and said she had a small surprise. She had prepared a little slideshow for Daniel, a collection of photographs from their time together, and she wanted to share it before dessert. She nodded to Marcus, who produced a small remote and pointed it toward the projection screen that had been set up at the far end of the room. What appeared on that screen was not a slideshow of their relationship. I had made a phone call at 9 o'clock the previous evening. I had spoken to one of the individuals in the room for 14 minutes. The slideshow Cassandra had loaded onto that remote had been replaced. The first image was a scanned copy of a civil court filing from Knox County, Tennessee, dated 2017. The name Sandra Rivas appeared in bold letters at the top of the document. Below it, the details of the disputed inheritance case. Below that, a photograph taken from the Knox County Public Record, Sandra Rivas, in her mid-30s, looking directly at the camera with an expression I had seen across a great many courtroom tables in my life. There was a moment, approximately 2 seconds, where the room did not yet understand what it was looking at. Then Cassandra understood. She did not scream. I will give her that. She stood up from her chair in one controlled motion, and for a moment she was completely still, her eyes moving from the screen to me to Marcus across the table. Marcus was already pushing back from his seat. He had calculated the exits before I had even sat down, which told me something about how long he had been doing this. He did not reach the door. Detective Morrow's people were faster. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I had learned a long time ago that the quietest voice in a room that has suddenly become very loud is the one that gets heard. I looked at my son. Daniel was staring at the screen with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not anger, not fear exactly, but the particular look of a person whose understanding of the world has just been reorganized without their consent. His hands were flat on the tablecloth. He was very still. I said his name once. He turned and looked at me. I told him I needed him to trust me for the next few minutes, that I would explain everything, and that he was safe. I told him the coffee he had been drinking had been switched before it reached the table, and that Dr. Tran would explain the rest when we had a moment. He looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded once, and I crossed the room and put my hand on the back of his neck the way I had done when he was a child with a fever, and I felt him exhale for the first time in what I suspect had been several weeks. Cassandra was detained outside the restaurant on the sidewalk. Marcus was taken into custody in the parking structure adjacent to the building. I watched through the tall glass windows as the lights of the patrol units reflected against the brick exterior of the building, blue and red against the warm Georgia night, and I thought about the quiet Vietnamese man in the small shop on the edge of town who had grabbed my arm and told me to stay and listen, and how those 3 words had been the difference between a wedding and a funeral. Daniel sat next to me in the restaurant long after the other guests had left. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked me how I had known. I told him I hadn't known, I had only heard, and then I had worked. He asked me why I hadn't told him immediately, why I had sat through 2 hours at his kitchen table with a glass of wine and said nothing. I told him the truth, because I needed evidence before I brought him a story that would require him to dismantle the entire architecture of the last 14 months. And I was not willing to make him go through that without the foundation of something true and solid and irrefutable beneath him. He deserved the truth delivered with both hands, not a suspicion delivered like a grenade. He was quiet again for a while after that. Then he said, "Dad, you ate dinner with her. You sat at the table." I told him that was the job. He looked at me with the same open face he had always had, nothing hidden, nothing guarded, and for a moment he was 7 years old again, and I was the person who knew how to fix things. Yeah, he said softly. I guess it was. I want to say something directly to every parent listening to this right now, because I know many of you are here, because some part of you recognized this story before it was finished. You have felt that particular helplessness, the one that arrives when someone you love has chosen to believe a person you cannot trust. And the more you say, the further away they move. I know that feeling. I lived inside it for 3 days that felt like a decade. Here is what those 3 days taught me. Your instincts as a parent are not paranoia. They are pattern recognition built from decades of watching one specific human being, their habits, their posture, the exact sound their laugh makes when it is real versus polite. No one on earth has the data you have on your own child. When something doesn't fit, it doesn't fit for a reason. You do not stop protecting your children because they are adults. You adjust your methods. You get quiet. You get patient. You get precise. Predators count on the people who love the victim to be loud and emotional and easy to discredit. They frame protective concern as jealousy, as control, as the sad desperation of a parent who can't let go. Don't be loud. Be methodical. Gather what is real and present it when it cannot be argued with. It is always better to be the difficult parent for 3 terrible days than to spend the rest of your life standing at a gravestone wondering what you might have done. Cassandra and Marcus were indicted on charges that included attempted murder, criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and identity fraud. The Knox County case was reopened in connection with the death of the widower from 2016. The plea negotiations, as of the last communication I received from the district attorney's office, are not going particularly well for either of them. Daniel spent 2 months in a quiet and careful kind of grief, the kind that comes not from losing someone but from understanding who that person actually was. I watched him work through it the way I had watched him work through every hard thing in his life. Slowly, honestly, without shortcuts. The lake house in Hilton Head still belongs entirely to him. He went there in the fall and called me from the dock on a Sunday evening, just to talk. I cannot tell you that a story like this ends cleanly. The scar tissue is real. The wariness that follows betrayal takes a long time to soften. But I can tell you that on that Sunday evening, my son called me from a dock at sunset, and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular. Baseball, the drive down, a book he was reading, a student who had surprised him. And at the end of the call, before he hung up, he said, "I'm glad you were there, Dad." There are moments in a person's life that become load-bearing, moments that everything else, going forward, rests upon. That phone call is one of mine. To Henry Nguyen, the man who locked his front door and steered me into a fitting alcove and pressed his finger to his lips, the Sunday dinners at my table are yours for as long as you want them. That debt does not expire. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that a parent's love is not a sentiment but a discipline, a practice, a daily choice to show up even when the showing up is the hardest thing in the room, hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? I read every single one. When the people we love are in danger, we don't always get to be loud about saving them. Sometimes love looks like patience, sitting across the table from someone you know is a threat, and keeping your voice warm and your hands steady. Raymond didn't save his son by raising an alarm. He saved him by being quiet, careful, and completely certain that his child was worth every hard step of the work. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, offered as entertainment and as a gentle reminder that the people who love us most are often working hardest in the quietest moments.